On Thursday 8 and Friday 9 September, I went out into the field to volunteer for a research project. And both times, we went to different plots in the Central Highlands of Victoria. So these plots were harvesting sites, which means that they cut down trees here for timber production. And after the harvesting, the plot is usually burnt and sown, which is actually done to promote the regeneration of a new cohort of trees. How this works, I will teach you in a later episode. So the trees of the new cohort are all Alpine ash, Eucalyptus delegatensis. And like many Australian species, Alpine ash is adapted to fires. And specifically, it is adapted to fires happening every 20 to 30 years. So part of the reason is that it takes Alpine ash 15 to 20 years to reach reproductive maturity, meaning they can produce seed for the next generation. So as long as fires don't happen within that maturation period, the seed production will be sufficient to support a new generation. However, with an ever-changing climate, fire severity and fire intensity are increasing. And since 2002, more than 85% of Alpine ash bioregion has been burned by several fires. So if these fires happen so frequently that the trees cannot reach reproductive maturity, then there won't be enough seed to support a next generation to ensure the survival of the population. Modeling by the University of Melbourne shows that without intervention, 20,000 hectares of Alpine ash forest could be lost every 20 years. To put that into perspective, that's an area the size of the city of Groningen, and I'm not talking about just the inner suburbs. Lost every 20 years. So in order to protect this species, Greening Australia and Minderoo Foundation, two Australian non-profit organizations, funded a research project which was accepted by the University of Melbourne. And that's where we come in. Dr. Benjamin Wagner is the research coordinator and manager of this project, and with him and another Ben, field technician Ben Smith, we drove to the plots to do the field work. We drove to Powelltown in our big four-wheel drive, and what really stood out to me from the drive were the elevational differences. And after about an hour, we arrived at the plot. And speaking of elevation, look at the view from this plot. Right, so after getting lost in awe for a bit, back to the work. Here's what happened. We laid out tape measures to mark the boundaries of the plot. The site was about 50 meters wide and about 300 meters long. On every 2.5 meter along the width, a tape measure was rolled out to form lines along the length of the plot. And those lines are what we call transects. And along these transects, the planting contractors planted seedlings of Alpine ash every 2.5 meter. But they weren't just any Alpine ash seedlings. Their seeds were all sourced from different places throughout Australia. We call those provenances. It's basically their origin, right? So there are a total of 21 defined provenances spread throughout the entire geographical range of Alpine ash, which is from New South Wales and Victoria to Tasmania. So the seeds were all collected from the origin of their provenance, then brought to a nursery in New South Wales where they were grown into seedlings. And every seedling came with a little QR code tag on which the provenance of the tree is coded. So here's what we did. As the planting contractors planted the seedlings along the transect, we chased after them with a tablet. And we used the tablet to scan those QR codes, so we can store the provenance and coordinates of each tree. That way, we will know for each tree where they're from and where they were planted. But why on earth do we want that information? Well, the main aim of this project is to find the provenances that best deal with certain climatic and topographic conditions. The 9 sites in total were all chosen for their specific conditions. For example, the sites I visited ranged from 400 to 600 meters above sea level. But there are also sites which are much higher and lower than this. And because of that, some provenances will do well in some sites and bad in others. And the main goal is to find the provenances which do the best across all our sites, because we predict that these Alpine ashes are best adapted to future climatic conditions. You could say that they are super seeds. Also, next to the total 9 sites in the field, there will also be 3 smaller ones in the field station at Burnley that I showed you before. So, like you see here, we are tagging along a transect, and since each one is about 75 to 100 meters, and every 2.5 meter is another seedling, you're looking at 30 to 40 each transect. And after that, you move on to the next, and next, and the next, until the whole plot is done. And we managed to get it done, come rain or sunshine. Anyway, total tally of the first day was around 1200 Alpine ash seedlings planted and tagged. And after that, the sites are supposed to be fenced to protect the little seedlings from browsing by wombats, wallabies, and even invasive deer.
Wait, invasive? What does that mean?
So sometimes we call a species invasive when they are introduced into the wild in places where they do not belong. So for example, like European or Indian deer in Australia. That alone does not make a species invasive, but it does when that species poses a threat to the local biodiversity, and deer can do that by eating or trampling native plants. After that we went back home since these were day trips and prepared for the next day of fieldwork. The next morning I stood up at 5:30, we drove to our next plot, which was a 2-hour drive this time, and did the same job as the day before. This plot was at a lower elevation than the previous, and I immediately saw some floral differences. Luckily, we didn't have as many seedlings as yesterday, but still probably around 1,000. But more importantly, the weather was nothing to complain about. And on the way home, I was rewarded for all my hard work by getting my first wallaby on tape. On Monday 12 and Tuesday 13 September, I did another round of fieldwork for the Forest Global Earth Observatory, or ForestGEO. This is an initiative by the Smithsonian Institute, which you might know for their world-famous museums. So ForestGEO is a global network of forest sites which are monitored for long-term research. And the main aim of this long-term research is to increase our understanding of forest ecosystems and build up capacity in the field of forest science. So, why is this important? Well, we already established from the Greening Australia project that forests are very vulnerable to climate change driven fires. And these forests are no exception. So for the sake of conservation, we need to monitor how climate change impacts these forests. As of now, there are 74 sites spread across 28 countries. And as you can see, Australia is actually not one of them. At least, not yet. That's what we were here for. So Professor Patrick Baker aims to add Australian forests to this network. And we helped him achieve that. So what did we do? We first laid out the boundaries of our plots with tape measures. The plots are 20 by 20 meter. Then we divided our plots into 4 equal squares by running a tape measure through the center of each side. We call these quadrants, and they are all 10 by 10 meters. Then we moved on to the real work. We started off in one quadrant, and there we measured all stems of live trees with a diameter of 2 centimeter or above. Right, so anything that's dead or too thin could be ignored. Doesn't mean that there weren't a lot of measurements to be done though. First, our field technician Ben Smith tagged all stems for us with a unique code in ascending order. At the same time, he also marked them at 1.3 meters height using yellow chalk. Here you can see me doing it, so you can get an idea of how it's done. Then we followed after him doing our measurements. We recorded the species, the XY coordinates of the tree within the quadrant, and the diameter around breast height. So remember the markings Ben made with the yellow chalk? The ones at 1.3 meters height? So that's the standardized value for breast height. So around that mark, the diameter is measured. And after getting all these measurements, we mark the trees with yellow paint so that if we come back in 1 or 5 years, we can still see where we measured the diameter. So we did that for all stems within a quadrant, usually about 50 to 75 trees, and then moved on to the next quadrant until the whole plot is done. And we worked at a rate of about 1 plot per day. So you can count on about 200 to 300 trees per day. Not as much as the Greening Australia project, right? Well, you might have noticed already, we were now actually working inside the forest. And this one had a pretty dense understory. So those are basically the trees that grow beneath the canopy, the dwarf trees, so to speak. You can imagine that if the understory is dense, it can be quite difficult to make your way through the vegetation here, especially when you have plants like the spike wattle with their very spiky stems. Oh, but did I also tell you that if they have leaves, that the leaves are spiky too? Oh, but there's another one that's pretty notorious. It's called wiregrass. And these grasses stick to any type of fabric, and they are really strong. Having wiregrass stuck to your pants while you're trying to walk feels like escaping a fishnet. It's real tripwire. And if it's stuck to your skin and you try to yank it off, you can be left with some really bad cuts. So, that's Australia for ya. So anyway, after the first plot, Ben brought us to the accommodation where I'd stay for 1 night since I made it a 2-day trip.
Hey up abovers! So I just returned from a hard day's work at the ForestGEO plots here at Starvation Creek, and because we're going back again tomorrow, I just wanted to share that I'm basically staying the night at an accommodation out in the nearby town of Warburton. And what I mainly also wanted to share was that I finally get to sleep on a normal bed. Woo!
Anyway, the next day we did the same thing for another plot. Specialty, we were frequently visited by a young superb fairy wren. Here's a picture I took of an adult male much later to show you what it looks like when it grows up. For now, it's only got the blue on its tail. After the second day, I headed back to Melbourne, while the rest of the group stayed to work on the project. And once all the plots are done, the data will be collected and will become part of the ForestGEO network.
Good morning up abovers. It's Friday the 16th of September, which means it's a fieldwork day again. And today I'm heading out into the field for my own project. Now you've noticed that I've been going to the field a lot lately, and you might think that the life of a biologist is very exciting and all that stuff. Well, I mean, it is exciting to go out into the field, but you have to realize those things come with sacrifices, because right now it's 5:30 a.m. and that's basically the standard if you want to go out in the field. You gotta get up very early. So life is not always sunshine and rainbows, even for a biologist.
So, onto the field trip. To reach our destinations, we drove through Blackspur Drive, which is a beautiful road that runs straight through the Central Highlands forest. And as you look out your window, you will see massive eucalypts. And those are called mountain ash. And they are the largest flowering plant in the world. The road also leads up to a pretty high elevation, so at some point the weather turns pretty quickly. So our first destination was near Acheron Way, which is the road we were supposed to take after Blackspur Drive. However, this road appeared to be closed off, so we had to go off-road. Not as comfortable as Acheron Way would have been, I reckon. And guess what? Even these off-road tracks were closed at times. For different reasons though. But luckily we had Ben, and Ben has a chainsaw. In the end, we met our match though, and we decided to proceed on foot.
Yeah, so it's a bigger Persoonia.
Hey up abovers. I'm making my way through a dry sclerophyll forest.
Wait. What?
A dry sclerophyll forest.
Well, that's a word you'll never hear about Dutch nature. So, sclerophyll is a type of vegetation which is characterized by its thick and scrubby leaves, because they are adapted to dry and hot conditions. Now, some examples of these sclerophyllous plants are eucalypts or acacias.
I'm making my way through a dry sclerophyll forest in the Mozambique Coop, which is near Acheron Way, and I'm making it through a very thick ground layer of ferns. But over here in Australia, you wouldn't believe what kind of ferns they have. Alright, so this is the one I'm talking about. Over here in Australia, they have huge tree ferns. Look at the size of this one. Absolutely astonishing. It's almost the size of 2 Julians.
And just a short walk later, I found one that was at least 3 times my size.
But basically everything in Australia is super huge over here. We have some sedges in Europe as well, but none of them are this big.
So what we actually did today was just some scanning of the area to find the species that I'm going to do my research on. Persoonia arborea, or the tree geebung. And although it's generally considered a threatened species, it didn't take long to find one. I found my first, then my second, and probably also my 50th, because within its geographical restricted boundaries, it is actually a quite common plant. So when we came across one, we made some general observations, for example like their size, whether they bore fruit, or some visible scarring from fire. And after that was done, we moved on to the next plot. So after an approximate 1 hour drive, we finally made it to our next destination. Look at where I am now, up above us. This is Smythe Creek, our next coop. So according to Ben, we were standing at an elevation of about 500 meters. And then we made our way down from this barren wasteland to a lower, very dense forest. So whereas before we've had to squeeze our way through a thick layer of ground ferns at Mozambique, here at Smythe Creek it is a thick layer of medium-sized shrubs, and you can tell it's a lot more difficult. Also over here, heaps of Persoonia around. And there actually might be a reason for that. Jules in the field will explain why. Okay, up above us, I've made it out of the tall shrubbery, and now I'm walking on basically a logging road. This is where the large vehicles came through, so you can imagine that there has been a lot of mechanical disturbance on this path. You would expect that nothing would grow here, but for some reason, my subject of conservation grows here like weeds. So this is the old logging road I'm walking on, and if you walk a bit over here, you can find Persoonia arborea sprouting up in the middle of this logging road. And if we walk a bit further, there's another one over here, right in the center. So it looks like Persoonia arborea responds pretty well to disturbance. Wonder what that's going to mean for my research. These weeks I've maintained my plant focus routine, but added some variations like these banded planch holds. During this hold, my core was the first to give out, instead of my shoulders. Seeing as the form is relatively good, I figured my core might be lagging behind. I decided to add some core training to my workouts in the form of dragon flags, famously invented by Bruce Lee. It had been a long time since I did dragon flags, here's one of my earlier attempts, but before I could actually feel it in the core, I gave out because my elbow started hurting. I was sure my form must have been wrong. Although the dragon flag is also a pulling exercise, the purpose is to train the core. I was clearly using my arms too much. I found a fix though, so the bend of the elbow must be at least 90 degrees. So in other words, contact point with the bends should be a bit lower. And success! Correct form dragon flag, not held back by elbow pain. So from this point on, my workout routine will consist of 3 sets of planche isometrics, 3 sets of planche push-ups, and 3 sets of core, as either dragon flags or leg raises. And with that, we've come to the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching. Your Australian word for the day is, well, there are actually 2. They are bush and outback. So they refer to landscapes, but they are not strictly defined. Overall, the bush refers to areas of vegetated wilderness, which are not necessarily very remote. So you find these mostly a bit more along the coast, where most of civilization is. So the fieldwork places where I went to could be referred to as the bush. The outback, on the other hand, usually refers to the very remote, arid wastelands that you can find more inland of Australia. So think of bush as more green and outback as more red. There are no official boundaries, they're just descriptive. As always, subscribe to the channel and share these videos too, because it really helps me to make better videos as well. Don't forget to follow me on my Instagram and Facebook if you want to see photos of my adventure. Also visit julzdownunder.com to read frequent blog posts, and if you like the music that I used in this video, make sure that you visit my SoundCloud at Julz Down Under. Looks like that's it. See ya!